In my introduction to Rebecca, we touched on the fact that Hitchcock had some reservations about this film. Truffaut asked Hitchcock in the interview, "Are you satisfied with Rebecca?" And Hitchcock answers, "Well, it's not really a Hitchcock picture. It's a novelette, really. The story is old fashioned. There was a whole school of feminine literature at that period, and though I'm not against it, the fact is that the story is lacking humor." So, leaving aside the potential misogyny of the Hitchcock claim that feminine literature of the time was lacking in humor, it seems clear that something about this film made Hitchcock feel that he didn't have full control. And as we noted in that introductory lecture, Selznick, as producer, had quite a bit of control over the film. But again, as we've discussed, auteur theory says that an auteur's signature shines through even in situations like under the studio system in Hollywood, where a director had less control over the entire production. And in fact, if you remember, Andrew Sarist in Notes on Auteur Theory indicates that an auteur's work is actually most interesting when you can see it in the stifling studio system era, where a director did, in fact, have less control. So, if we do accept this idea of Hitchcock as an auteur, then maybe we should, for the sake of discussion, reject Hitchcock's own characterization of the film as not a Hitchcock picture and ask ourselves instead, what evidence do we see of his hand in this film, even if he had less control than he would have liked, and that he calls it a novelette instead of a Hitchcock film? I think there are several things that strike me in Rebecca as being specifically Hitchcockian, and that's partly in the visual storytelling and the visual motifs, things, of course, that we've been talking about throughout the quarter so far. Truffaut points out that in the relationship between Mrs. De Winter, played by Joan Fontaine, and Mrs. Danvers, we see what Truffaut notes as a kind of classic Hitchcock relationship, particularly as that comes out in the visual style. Truffaut notes that that's a relationship that reappears time and again later on, not only in the scenarios, meaning kind of the writing or the screenplay, but even visually. Two faces, one dead still, as if petrified by fear of the other, the victim and the tormentor framed in the same image. So there, Truffaut, of course, is offering this kind of purely visual depiction, or Truffaut is characterizing it as a truly visual depiction of their relationship and of the power imbalance between them. So, in kind of thinking about again, Hitchcock has control over the visuals here in many ways. So it's hard not to see Hitchcock's hand there, especially if we can see that same kind of image that Truffaut describes in Hitchcock's later films. As Hitchcock points out too, Mrs. Danvers is first seen from from Mrs. De Winter's perspective, and a subjective perspective, a perspective that it's a subjective perspective that perceives Mrs. Danvers as this perpetual threat. And that kind of visual subjectivity, that subjective POV, is really important to Hitchcock's works. I mean, I would say in some ways it's even central to his work. And Hitchcock himself says that when he's talking about this relationship or the POV in terms of Mrs. De Winter and how she perceives Mrs. Danvers, Hitchcock himself says, "In this way, the whole situation was projected from the heroine's point of view. She never knew when Mrs. Danvers might turn up. And this in itself was terrifying." And I love this moment here, this introduction to Mrs. Danvers, when Mrs. Danvers really slides from the left into Mrs. Winter's point of view when she first meets her, as if Mrs. De Winter is really out of control of Mrs. Danvers, so much so that she can't even turn her head to look. But it's this Mrs. Danvers that has this control kind of over her the POV or what Mrs. De Winter sees. We should note, of course, that I'm calling her Mrs. De Winter because we don't ever know her first name. We have this name Rebecca that's coming up over and over and over in the film, but Rebecca, of course, is a person that is not in the film. Her presence simply haunts the film. So we have the new Mrs. De Winter, but we never know her first name. So I'm going to kind of refer to her as I'm talking throughout this film as Mrs. De Winter, or Joan Fontaine, the actress that is playing the new Mrs. De Winter. There are also, in terms of kind of continuing to think about the visuals and the visual storytelling, there are a number of other examples of visual storytelling that, to me, seem specifically Hitchcockian. So there are, for example, the very opening of the film, or near the very opening, there are these waves, and it's, even though we don't know Rebecca yet, or who she is, or how she's related to this person we see standing here, it's this visual of Rebecca before we even know her. She's often throughout the film associated with waves and the sea. And we see that in the beginning. And there's that on the bottom right there, there's that really wonderful dissolve of the Rebecca's address book with the R on it. And it's literally immersed in the waves there. There's also that whole opening sequence where we see Max, where we're first introduced to Max, and it's all told in the visuals. We don't know, we haven't met him yet, so we don't know what he's thinking. But in retrospect, we realize, of course, that he's thinking of Rebecca and he's perhaps contemplating suicide. The sort of shift from that vertiginous kind of high point of view angle and then the low view angle up on Max, and then you have this close up on his feet which shift a little bit, and then this viewpoint of his face. I mean, it's hard not to see it as if he is tempted to leap over the edge, and that is all told in the visuals. And so our understanding of Max and our first introduction to his psychology is in this specifically visual storytelling, and in the editing and the kind of different camera angles and the way that it moves from this long shot to close up. So definitely showing us strictly visual means there. And then there's also this wonderful scene where it's an example of, again, everything happening in the visuals, and it's overshadowed, and the visuals overshadow the dialogue. So we have Mrs. Van Hopper and Joan Fontaine's character there, and then Max comes onto the scene. And what's happening there in terms of the dialogue is Max and Mrs. Van Hopper are talking, but really what's happening is in the visuals. The kind of tension of the shot is in the visuals as Max and Fontaine's character are exchanging glances, and the glances are really more important than what Mrs. Van Hopper is saying, and that's all kind of in the framing and the editing there. Also, notably, the Donald Spoto points out that the way that Fontaine's character here is depicted, she is literally visually diminished, and she's clearly in the control of Mrs. Van Hopper. And so she's a kind of establishing her dominance over her, and the frame tells us that. Spoto notes, by placing the Fontaine character in the extreme right of the frame, the bottom left-hand image there, she's almost pushed off view by the busty Bates and the overwhelming glamour of Olivier. Olivier, too, himself, he's kind of looming over her in the shot, in the previous shots, and so he himself, both of them overshadow Fontaine. It's really kind of a fascinating thing to do with our protagonist, to make her so visually small and so dominated by these other characters. But that's, of course, a key part of her personality. But it's a really interesting person to be connected to, someone who is so dominated by other people, both kind of visually and from a personality perspective. A few other visual moments that I was thinking of. There's that moment when the marriage license, they almost forget the marriage license, and the marriage license flutters down, and it's kind of see it as a foreshadowing of the fragility of their marriage. Then on the right side to this moment, what is supposed to be really joyous, that she's just gotten married, but Joan Fontaine's character is visually dwarfed by these flowers in the foreground that Max gives her. And flowers, just like these images of the waves, are kind of repeatedly associated with Rebecca. So in a way, it's this bit of foreshadowing that Joan Fontaine's character is going to be diminished and overshadowed and overwhelmed by this character, Rebecca, who she actually doesn't really even know yet, of course, or know too much about. There's also this really wonderful visual parallel that we get between these women, and this is one that Donald Spoto notes out. He says that the camera associates Mrs. Danvers with Mrs. Van Hopper. Mrs. Van Hopper had made her exit from the Monte Carlo hotel room by opening the door and surveying Joan Fontaine contemptuously from head to foot. And it's a long shot that's repeated exactly moments later with the same action and glance offered to Fontaine by Mrs. Danvers in the first bedroom sequence. So it's a really interesting moment. I mean, that moment with Mrs. Van Hopper, and she is despising Joan Fontaine's character, and she's very contemptuous of her, and we feel for her in that moment. And then she escapes from Mrs. Van Hopper, which is a moment of release. But the moment that she gets back gets into this her new home, we have another woman figure who is going to dominate her. And it's this, again, this visual parallel that tells us the sort of situation that Joan Fontaine's character has walked into. Also, just the use of shadows and lighting in this film is really wonderful. I love this image here with Mrs. Danvers and Joan Fontaine's character, creating this really eerie kind of ghostly effect as if they're in a haunted house. The lighting makes sense, but it has a really nice psychological impact. And then, of course, repeatedly throughout the film, we have the presence of Rebecca, this visual presence, even though she's not there. So this dead woman who is constantly represented visually, even though she's physically not here. We see that R repeated in various ways. And then there's also the constant presence of the dog. Even though the dog there on the right is quite small in the frame, it's kind of this sort of blot in a way on Joan Fontaine's character's conscience. And we're going to talk a little bit more in a moment about something called the Hitchcockian blot, which comes up in Hitchcock's films repeatedly. And I will say one note here about the R that Joan Fontaine's character is looking at and being overshadowed by in that image on the left. And of course, the R keeps coming back. One of the things that David O. Selznick wanted at the very end of the film is he wanted, when the house is going up in smoke, he wanted the smoke to form into the shape of an R, which is totally not something that Hitchcock would do, because Hitchcock does not like that overt fantasy, right? He wants things to be dramatic, but not out and out fantasy. So fortunately, I think for us, Hitchcock overruled Selznick's idea of making the smoke form into the shape of an R. That would have been completely ridiculous, I think. And so fortunately, we didn't get that version of the R in this film. This sequence too, I love this wonderful sequence here where, of course, Max is telling Joan Fontaine's character what happened and how Rebecca died. And the camera is focused on an empty space, of course. But as Max is telling it, the camera moves as if to follow Rebecca, this dead woman. And it's a beautiful representation of, again, I think Joan Fontaine's imagination. So there's not literally a ghost there, but it's as if Rebecca herself is visually represented in this empty space. And then, of course, the camera focuses on things like on the top right-hand side there, these vases full of dead flowers. And again, flowers often and vases often represent Rebecca throughout the film. So again, a wonderful representation of something that isn't there, but it's a beautifully done visual storytelling. We should also note I love the architecture in this house and the way that the characters, particularly Joan Fontaine, is framed within this house. It's a huge house, of course, and Fontaine is quite literally dwarfed by everything. As Tanya Modilewski notes in her essay on Rebecca, it's a really good essay on Rebecca, by the way, but she says the mise en scène and camera work collaborate with the script to convey the heroine's sense of her own insignificance. She's continually dwarfed by huge halls, and even the doorknobs are placed at shoulder level. We have the impression of her as a child peeking in or intruding into an adult world. So, and again, these are all beautiful representations of something that is done visually, but it's a kind of this internal quality that's happening with Joan Fontaine's character. And that top left-hand image there too, Joan Fontaine is actually in the shot, but she almost blends into the house as if she's not even a presence there, but Mrs. Danvers is the one that stands out. Modilewski also notes an interesting element of kind of the way that the camera movement offers us a kind of an interesting insight into the psychology of the character. She says that there's a characteristic camera movement in the film that begins with the close-up of the heroine receiving a bit of unwelcome news about Rebecca's superiority, and then tracking out to a long shot in which she seems small and helpless and alone. She gives this example. For example, when Mrs. Danvers attempts to persuade Joan Fontaine's character to jump out of the window to her death, and the camera's kind of placed outside or above the window, it begins to move away as if inviting her to her doom. So the camera movement itself is kind of an invitation to jump And it's again a kind of vertigo type feeling, which actually we'll see repeated in Hitchcock's films, specifically, of course, in Vertigo later on. There's also this really wonderful visual sequence here with Fontaine dressing up and descending the stairs. And in this instance, we're again immersed in her perspective and in her anticipation. It's quite an extended sequence, a beautiful example of suspense. And they seem not to notice her, the people that she's moving towards, for longer than usual. Kind of that, again, that stretching out of anticipation. But it's also this immersion in Fontaine's point of view, and it's kind of unbearable because we know something bad is going to happen, and sort of the joyful anticipation on her face is is a nice contrast to the irony of what we know is going to happen. This is kind of the classic bomb under the table, but it's more of a personal kind of psychological bomb that's about to go off that we know is going to happen. Just a few other moments. I also really love this on the left-hand side there. There's this high-angle camera that follows Joan Fontaine's character and Max to the car after they're going out of the courtroom. And it really gives us this sense of being watched. It's a slightly uneasy feeling. But then, of course, a moment later, Favel appears, and so the camera in a way foreshadows that someone is watching them and that they are about to appear. And of course, he indeed does. And then, of course, there's this wonderful image of Mrs. Danvers at the end of the film, like a ghost wandering in the house, kind of emblematic of her lostness and a relationship with the dead, ghostly Rebecca. Another beautiful image of the Hitchcock using visuals. Now, the one I wanted to get to too, which I think is really interesting, there's another classic Hitchcock visual that's repeated in his films, and it's really interesting, and you'll see it repeated in films like Strangers on a Train. It's called the Hitchcockian blot. It was coined by a guy named Slavoj Žižek. He's a Lacanian cultural critic, he kind of does with psychoanalysis, kind of Freudian type stuff. But basically, what it is, he describes it as a characteristic visual design of Hitchcock's films, in which a place in the visual field, usually at the central vanishing point of the image, you can see that depicted on the right two images there, what the vanishing point of the image is, contains a privilege. So that point of the image in Hitchcock's films contains a privileged object that functions as a kind of stain or blot that cues the spectator to the disruptive, threatening presence of shadow or chaos world that subtends the everyday world of appearances and social respectability. So just to give you an example of kind of how that works in Hitchcock's films, here there are just a few instances, and this is how this is the description from Richard Allen's really great little book. If you're interested in more books on Hitchcock, it's called Hitchcock's Romantic Irony. But this is how he describes this scene, and specifically how the Hitchcockian blot is used. So when the second Mrs. De Winter dines with her new husband Maxime after she has first arrived at Manderley, Hitchcock begins with a scene with a tight close-up of the napkin with the telltale inscription of Rebecca's monogram. The camera slowly pulls back and up, revealing between the couple seated revealing the distance seated between the couple seated at either end of the dining hall and the huge floral arrangements on the far walls, which signal Rebecca's continual presence in the house. The shot ends in a bird's eye view that frames the scene with two large black funereal urns, which suggest how the deathly presence of Rebecca in the house bestows an aura of death upon their apparently perfect marriage. So it's a really wonderful scene because, I mean, it does a number of things, right? Where it again shows us the way that Fontaine's character is dwarfed by this house. But it's also just such a beautiful example of how Hitchcock is visually telling us again that Rebecca is dominating the scene, or or the memory of her is kind of a blot on the scene by starting on that close up there of the napkin and then slowly dollying out and back until that the napkin, we can't see it anymore, but it's still kind of resting in our consciousness in a way, in the same way that it's resting on Joan Fontaine's character's conscience. Also, Well, Hitchcock kind of feels that this is sort of a fairy tale melodrama. It's hard to get away from these classic sequences of Hitchcockian suspense. Of course, we noted the sequence where Fontaine's character is going down the stairs, but then there's also just this really wonderful sequence where Fontaine, early on in the film, she's ordered to leave to go with Mrs. Van Hopper, and she is desperately trying to find Maxime. She can't reach him on the phone. She tries to find him again, and then when she finally gets in touch with him, and Mrs. Van Hopper comes into the room, there's that anticipation of Mrs. Van Hopper's reaction when she finds out that these two are going to be married. And it's not really, again, a sequence of fear, but it is that stretching out of anticipation that Hitchcock and Truffaut were talking about. There's also the suicide sequence that's goaded by Mrs. Danvers. Will Joan Fontaine's character give in to what Mrs. Danvers is suggesting or not? There's also the courtroom sequence there, and I have on the bottom there, where we're immersed in Fontaine's point of view and in her worry really about Max's reaction. Will he get pushed into anger? What will this character Ben say? What does the boat expert have to say? So that whole courtroom sequence is really a wonderful example of the way that Hitchcock develops suspense in a particular sequence. There's also that reveal moment about Rebecca when that Rebecca why Rebecca went to the doctor, and we have this moment that's built up of what is this doctor going to say about Rebecca said. There's also that drive back to Manderley where we get the very end where Max is going there and we get a sense of something being wrong. And we haven't seen Fontaine's character in a while, so we're a bit worried about her. We also know about the phone call that Flavel made to Danvers. So there's a development of the sense of anticipation. What is Max going to find when he gets there? And then, so there are those sequences of suspense. But I think it's also interesting that Truffaut says that this film, Rebecca, isn't a thriller. And he says there was no suspense, which is interesting. He says it was simply a psychological story into which you, meaning talking to Hitchcock, you deliberately introduced the element of suspense around the conflict of personalities. So I'm not sure that I agree with Truffaut that it isn't suspense, but he does have a point that the suspense really is related to our identification with Fontaine's character and to her tension and her anxiety. And the film, its tension really builds around this anxiety that she has. She's worried about angering Max. She's worried about offending Mrs. Danvers. She's worried about making a fool of herself. Is she going to be able to hide the broken statue? Will she be able to deal with Flavel? I mean, all of our suspense is kind of wrapped up in her kind of anxiety about what's going to happen in relationship with the people around her. We should also consider the idea of where we see some Hitchcock themes here. Truffaut says to Hitchcock that this film is a fairy tale. He says it has a fable like quality that recurs in several of your works. And he says to Hitchcock, you're dealing with fear, that many of your pictures have that quality. Anything connected with fear takes us back to childhood. All of children's literature is linked to sensations, and particularly fear. And it is true that there are some kind of childhood like fears in this film that also play out in other Hitchcock films. In this film, we have this isolated, lonely house, something that we'll see repeated in The Birds as well as in Psycho. And then we also have this dreaming sequence and a kind of even dreaming quality about the film Rebecca, a kind of dreaming quality that turns into nightmare. Rebecca, the film, of course, begins with last night I dreamed of Manderley. And then there are many sequences that have a dreamlike kind of nightmarish quality. And we're also going to see that sort of dreamlike quality in something like Vertigo, where the dreamlike becomes nightmarish. So it's hard not to see, again, that kind of quality of dreaming and nightmare as linked to other Hitchcock films. Couple more quick links to some other themes that we could say Hitchcock themes. There's that sort of appearance versus reality theme that we've been talking about, and that of course threads its way through the entire film. This idea that Max appeared to love Rebecca and everyone thought so, but of course he didn't. And then there's also that Hitchcock theme that's repeated later in Psycho and Vertigo. And Spoto points out that there's the real horror and thinking that someone dead may be watching you and inviting your doom. So that's another theme that kind of links us to other Hitchcock films. Now, there are a few other questions that I want to pose about the film and kind of leave you to think about on your own. But this was sort of a lot to tease out, and I'm not sure that I myself particularly have all the answers, but I think they're worth thinking about. First of all, thinking about what really is the genre of the film. Is this a melodrama? Is it a thriller? Is it a mystery? Is it a romance? Should we call it a psychological drama? Perhaps it's maybe a mix between a kind of epic melodrama, because there certainly is a high exaggerated motion on a really large scale with sweeping scenes. It's very much akin to Gone with the Wind. Even the score of this film actually doesn't feel, that's one of the things about this film I think that doesn't feel actually so Hitchcockian, because the score is really overwhelming and it doesn't really feel, I mean, you think back to Blackmail and the sort of sparing use of score in that film, and the sparing use of score that we'll also see in things like Birds and Rear Window, that doesn't feel very Hitchcock, but it does feel akin to the kind of sweeping melodrama of something like Gone with the Wind. But there certainly is this element of a psychological thriller in this that's very much akin to something like Psycho and Vertigo. And that psychological drama aspect, I think, is really significant to Hitchcock. And he'll get more and more adept at that as he goes along. And we'll see it again, particularly in something like Psycho and Vertigo, where we get these really deep, profoundly uncomfortable dives into character psychology, particularly in Vertigo. But we did see that in something like Blackmail too, where we really were plunged into Alice's fear and trauma. And what we're left with, really, the uneasiness, a lot of the uneasiness is that we're left with at the end of the Blackmail has to do with the psychological torment of Alice more than anything at all. So I think, if anything, the drama of this film is in the torment of Joan Fontaine's character, the new Mrs. De Winter, and it is a psychological discomfort, a psychological torment. We are immersed in her discomfort and in her emotions and fears and insecurities. I'm also curious what you all think about what Spoto calls Max's brusque condescension towards Fontaine. What should we make of this relationship between him and new Mrs. Winter? I mean, does he love her? Does he in love with her? Why actually does he want to marry her? Does this relationship actually satisfy us? I mean, early on, especially, it almost feels like kind of an asexual relationship. When she says she loves him, for example, he says, "I thank you for that," which is a really strange response. And there's also kind of this father daughter flavor to the relationship for much of the film. He treats her like a child, giving her this kiss with his finger on her forehead there in that left image. He also stops her from going from her tennis lesson and kind of controlling her life. He tells her to stop biting her nails, something very much that a father might say to a child. He has this phrase, "You can't be too careful with children," when he wants her to wear this raincoat. He laughs at her when she tries to kind of dress up and be more grown up. And then he also has this line where he tells her, "Never be 36." And then at the moment when she does grow up and kind of take a little bit more control of her life, which I think is really satisfying for us as audience members, because I think in some ways we've been frustrated by her and the fact that she is not taking some control. But that's a moment when he almost seems visibly disappointed that she is kind of grown up after he finally tells her everything and treats her like an equal. And in that moment, she's dressed differently. Her hair is more put together. She walks with more confidence. But his response to her is, he says kind of disappointedly, "You've lost that funny, young lost look." Uh, so it's an interesting moment. But then, of course, we have like the first kiss, the real kiss, I think, that has something like an adult passion in it. So I'm not totally sure what to make of their relationship. I think it's a really odd relationship. And it's worth kind of teasing out and sort of thinking about what in the world is going on there. I think it's also worth thinking about what the film's view of women is. What strikes us about how the significant female characters here are characterized and what their relationship to men is or to each other is. Just a few key observations about these women. So Rebecca, she doesn't appear in the film, but what we know about her, what we're told about her, is that she's cold, domineering, she's calculating, she's very confident, she's sexually immoral and free. She's very dangerous and manipulative, and she's very insensitive to others. So hardly a flattering portrait of a woman. Then we have, of course, our main character, the new Mrs. De Winter. She's someone who is almost the opposite of Rebecca in some ways. She's very fragile. She's lost, helpless, dependent, childlike, quite sensitive to others to the point of losing her own personality. And we really, I think, long for her to be more self-determined. And then we have Mrs. Van Hopper. She, like Rebecca in many ways, is quite domineering. She's confident. She's insensitive to others. And then we also, of course, have Mrs. Danvers, another significant female character. She also is very cold, very domineering, very confident, very calculating. She's sinister, and we could also say that she's probably a lesbian. It's again, nothing is explicit, but her clear. I think there are some scenes where we see her clearly attracted to Rebecca. So there's a kind of discomfort, I think, with this idea that this woman who is really one of the key villains in the film, Mrs. Danvers, is connected to being a lesbian. So all these characterizations, really, of all of these women, even our protagonist, Joan Fontaine's character, they're pretty negative. And I will say that there is one significant point that kind of complicates that a little bit, that because our protagonist is Mrs. De Winter, Joan Fontaine's character, we do relate most to her, and we kind of suffer what she suffers, and we long for her to stand up for herself. There is a kind of longing for something in between the cold, calculating, domineering women that we see and the sort of very passive, too passive personality of Joan Fontaine's character. So in a way, the film is inviting us to kind of perhaps inviting us to long for a different kind of woman character. But whether the film is saying that all women are like these women, I'm not sure. And that's a bit troubling, of course, if it is. One last question, and I think this is a really important question that I don't have really time to tease out. There's a lot that could be said about it, though, is really what should we make of Rebecca? And what should we make of Mrs. Danvers? And what should we make of their relationship? Is Mrs. Danvers really so awful as she seems, or is that just the perspective of Max and also of a very passive protagonist, like Joan Fontaine's character? Is there room for any sympathy for Mrs. Danvers? Does the film invite any sympathy for her? Last and maybe most importantly, too, should we actually believe Max's characterization of Rebecca? Is she the person that everyone says she was? I mean, she seems to be someone who everyone thought was a certain way, but then Max says, no, she really wasn't that way. So, and his hatred for her is so deep and so profound. I think we do kind of have to wonder, how far should we take it? How should we trust his characterization? There has been a good bit of criticism about the idea that Rebecca might be the hero of the story. That's kind of a feminist reading of the text because she never really gets a voice in the film, and she's only filtered through what people say about her, mostly what men say about her. And this image here to me is always really striking. It's these circle of men standing around the body of the dead Rebecca. And there's something really striking and sinister about this image. These men are supposed to be, quote, the good guys, and Rebecca is supposed to be the villain. But there is, again, something quite unsettling about this image. I think that we have to, long after the film is over, I think we do have to wonder about this person, Rebecca, who really never gets a voice of her own, even though she is the titular character of the film.